Maya Chen adjusted her thick-rimmed glasses and wiped the sweat from her forehead as she hunched over the communications equipment. The desert heat was unbearable, even inside the armored vehicle that served as the mobile command center for Delta Squad. She had been with the team for 8 months now, and most days felt like an outsider looking in. The soldiers around her were giants compared to her small frame. They carried themselves with confidence born from years of combat experience, while Maya felt like she was constantly trying to prove herself worthy of being there. She wasn't a soldier, not really. She was just the tech support, the one who kept their radios working and their GPS systems running. "Chen, how's our satellite link looking?" Captain Rodriguez called out from the front of the vehicle. His voice carried the authority of someone who had led men through countless dangerous missions. "All green, sir," Maya replied, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. "We've got clear communication with base camp and the other squads." Sergeant Thompson, a burly man with arms covered in tattoos, glanced back at her with a mixture of amusement and mild annoyance. "Still can't believe they sent us a college girl instead of someone who actually knows how to fight," he muttered to his partner. Maya pretended not to hear the comment, though her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times since joining the team. The truth was, she didn't belong here in any traditional sense. While these men had trained for years to become elite soldiers, Maya had spent her time in computer labs and engineering workshops. Her path to this desert had been unusual. Fresh out of MIT with degrees in electrical engineering and computer science, she had been recruited by a government contractor to develop new communication systems for military operations. What she hadn't expected was to be assigned directly to a field unit as their technical specialist. The mission briefing that morning had been routine. Intelligence suggested a small group of insurgents was operating out of an abandoned facility about 50 miles northeast of their current position. Delta Squad was tasked with conducting reconnaissance and gathering information about enemy movements in the area. "This should be a walk in the park," Lieutenant Barnes had said during the briefing. "Intel shows maybe a dozen hostiles at most. We go in, take a look around, and get out clean." Maya had nodded along with the rest of the team, though she secretly hoped they wouldn't encounter any actual fighting. Her job was to maintain communications and monitor electronic surveillance equipment, not to engage in combat. She carried a sidearm like everyone else, but she had only fired it during training exercises. As their convoy of 3 vehicles wound through the rocky terrain, Maya found herself studying the landscape through the small reinforced window beside her workstation. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scattered rock formations and the occasional cluster of scraggly vegetation. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, but also deeply alien to someone who had grown up in the suburbs of Boston. "Target location coming up in 2 clicks, the driver announced. Captain Rodriguez picked up his radio. "All units, this is Delta 1 approaching objective. Maintain radio silence unless you spot something unusual." Maya checked her equipment one final time, making sure all the communication channels were clear and the recording devices were functioning properly. Everything looked normal. The thermal imaging showed the expected heat signatures from their own vehicles, but nothing else moving in the immediate area. The facility they were approaching had once been some kind of industrial complex, probably related to oil extraction based on the rusted pipeline visible in the satellite images. Now it was just another abandoned relic in a landscape full of them. Intelligence suggested the insurgents were using it as a staging area for attacks on supply convoys traveling the main highway, about 20 miles to the south. "Delta 2 and 3, take positions on the north and south approaches," Rodriguez ordered. "We'll go in through the main entrance." Maya watched her screens as the other 2 vehicles moved into position. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The thermal imaging still showed no signs of human activity around the target building. Either the insurgents weren't there, or they were very good at staying hidden. As their vehicle approached the main entrance of the facility, Maya noticed something odd on her electromagnetic spectrum analyzer. There was a faint signal that didn't match any of their own equipment. She frowned and adjusted the settings, trying to get a clearer reading. "Captain," she said hesitantly, "I'm picking up some kind of electronic signature from inside the building. It's not matching any known communication protocols." Rodriguez turned to look at her. "What kind of signature?" "I'm not sure. It's very faint and it keeps shifting frequencies. Could be some kind of jamming equipment or maybe improvised explosive devices with electronic triggers." The captain considered this information for a moment. Keep monitoring it. Let me know if anything changes. Maya nodded and focused on her equipment. The signal was definitely there, but it was unlike anything she had encountered during training. It had an almost organic quality to it, jumping between frequencies in what seemed like a random pattern. Their vehicle came to a stop about 100 yards from the main building. Through her window, Maya could see the crumbling concrete structure with its broken windows and rust-stained walls. It looked completely abandoned, just as the intelligence reports had indicated. "All right, people," Rodriguez said, checking his weapon. "Standard reconnaissance sweep. Thompson and Martinez, you're with me. Johnson and Davis, secure the perimeter. Chen, you stay with the vehicle and monitor communications." Maya felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. She was glad she wouldn't have to go into the potentially dangerous building. But part of her wanted to prove that she could handle more than just sitting behind a computer screen. As the soldiers prepared to disembark, Maya noticed that the strange electronic signature was getting stronger. The frequency shifts were becoming more rapid, almost like some kind of countdown sequence. She had never seen anything like it before, and something deep in her gut told her that they were walking into something much more dangerous than a simple reconnaissance mission. "Captain," she called out, but Rodriguez and his team were already moving toward the building, their weapons raised and ready. Maya watched them through her equipment, tracking their heat signatures as they approached the entrance. The mysterious electronic signal continued to pulse on her screen, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all about to find out just how wrong their intelligence had been. Maya's fingers flew across her keyboard as she tried to decode the increasingly erratic electronic signature. The pattern was becoming more aggressive, almost like a digital heartbeat that was speeding up with each passing second. She had seen similar patterns during her graduate research on improvised explosive devices. But this was far more sophisticated than anything a typical insurgent cell should have been able to construct. "Delta 1, this is base camp," came a crackling voice through her headset. "We're showing some unusual atmospheric interference in your area. Are you experiencing any communication difficulties?" Maya quickly checked her equipment readings. Everything on her end was functioning normally, but the mysterious signal was now strong enough to potentially cause interference with their radio communications. She grabbed her microphone to respond to base camp when the world suddenly exploded around her. The first indication something was wrong wasn't the sound of gunfire, but the complete failure of all electronic systems in their vehicle. Every screen went dark simultaneously, and Maya's carefully calibrated equipment died as if someone had thrown a master switch. In the sudden silence that followed, she could hear the distant sound of automatic weapons fire coming from the direction of the building. "What the hell?" Maya whispered, frantically trying to restart her systems. Nothing responded. Even her backup power supplies seemed to be completely dead. Through her window, she could see muzzle flashes coming from multiple positions around the facility, far more positions than intelligence had suggested were possible. The driver of her vehicle was already reaching for his radio when Maya realized the horrible truth. "Don't bother," she said grimly. "They hit us with some kind of electromagnetic pulse. Everything electronic is fried." Through the chaos of gunfire, Maya could hear Captain Rodriguez's voice shouting orders, but the words were lost in the noise of battle. She could see heat signatures on her one remaining piece of equipment, a hardened military-grade thermal scope that had somehow survived the electronic attack. What she saw made her blood run cold. There weren't a dozen insurgents as intelligence had suggested. There were at least 50 heat signatures surrounding the facility, and they had been waiting in concealed positions for Delta Squad to walk directly into their trap. The other two vehicles in their convoy were also under heavy fire, and from what Maya could see, her team was vastly outnumbered and completely cut off from any possibility of calling for backup. "We need to get out there and help them," the driver said, checking his weapon. Maya nodded, though her hands were shaking as she picked up her sidearm. She had trained for situations like this, but training was very different from the reality of people shooting at you with the intent to kill. The sound of bullets hitting their armored vehicle was like metallic rain, and she could see sparks flying as rounds struck the reinforced glass of her window. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of their vehicle, Maya made a decision that would change everything. Instead of just grabbing her weapon and following standard protocol, she quickly disconnected several pieces of her electronic equipment and stuffed them into her tactical vest. Most of it was dead, But there might be something she could use if she could figure out how the insurgents had managed to disable their systems so effectively. The moment they opened the vehicle door, the noise of battle became overwhelming. Maya had never experienced anything like the chaos of a real firefight. The air itself seemed to be full of flying metal, and the sound was so loud it was almost impossible to think. She followed the driver toward the building where Captain Rodriguez's team had taken cover, trying to stay low and move from one piece of cover to the next. Halfway to the building, Maya saw something that made her freeze in terror. Sergeant Thompson was lying motionless behind a concrete barrier, and she could see blood pooling beneath him. Lieutenant Barnes was trying to drag him to safety while still returning fire at the insurgents, who seemed to be everywhere at once. "Chen, get over here," Barnes shouted when he spotted her. "Thompson's hit bad." Maya ran the last 20 yards to their position, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode. When she reached Thompson, she could see that he had been shot in the leg and was bleeding heavily. Barnes was trying to apply pressure to the wound while simultaneously watching for enemy movement. "Where's the captain?" Maya asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Pinned down on the other side of the building with Martinez," Barnes replied. "We're completely surrounded and our radios are dead. This whole thing was a setup." Maya looked around at their desperate situation and realized that everything she had been taught about combat was about to be put to the ultimate test. But as she crouched there, listening to the sound of gunfire and watching the blood seep through Barnes's fingers, something unexpected happened. The panic and fear that had been threatening to overwhelm her suddenly crystallized into something else entirely. She found herself analyzing the situation with the same methodical approach she used to solve complex engineering problems. The insurgents had used an electromagnetic pulse weapon to disable their communications and electronic equipment. They had positioned themselves in a classic envelopment pattern designed to trap and eliminate the entire squad. But they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed that without their high-tech equipment, the American soldiers would be helpless. What they didn't know was that Maya Chen had grown up with a father who had been obsessed with military history and tactics. She had spent countless hours as a child playing war games and learning about famous battles throughout history. More importantly, she had an engineer's mind that could see patterns and solutions that others might miss. "Barnes," she said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I think I know how we can get out of this." The lieutenant looked at her with surprise. "Chen, this isn't a computer problem you can debug. These people are trying to kill us." "I know that," Maya replied, her voice suddenly calm and steady. "But I also know that they're using a classic envelopment tactic, and there's always a weakness in that kind of formation. We just have to find it and exploit it." As if to emphasize her point, a burst of gunfire erupted from a new position, sending concrete chips flying around their hiding spot. Maya ducked but continued studying the pattern of enemy fire. She was beginning to see something that the trained soldiers around her were missing. The insurgents were good, but they weren't perfect. And sometimes, the person who didn't think like a soldier was exactly what was needed to solve a military problem. Maya began to understand that her 8 months of feeling like an outsider hadn't been a weakness. It had been preparation for this exact moment, when conventional military thinking wasn't going to be enough to save their lives. She just hoped she was right, because if she was wrong, they were all going to die in this abandoned facility in the middle of the desert. Maya's mind raced as she studied the abandoned facility through her thermal scope. The building's layout was burned into her memory from the mission briefings, but now she was seeing it from an entirely different perspective. Where the soldiers saw walls and obstacles, Maya saw sightlines and angles of approach. Where they saw defensive positions, she saw mathematical problems waiting to be solved. "The insurgents are using the building's industrial layout against us," she explained to Barnes while keeping pressure on Thompson's wound. "They've positioned themselves in what they think are the strongest defensive positions, but they're actually following predictable patterns based on the building's architecture." Barnes looked at her skeptically. "Chen, I appreciate that you're trying to help, but we need to focus on staying alive long enough for backup to arrive." "That's just it," Maya said urgently. "Our communications are down. Base camp doesn't even know we're in trouble. If we're going to survive this, we need to take the initiative." Another burst of gunfire forced them to duck lower behind their concrete barrier. Maya could hear the distinctive sound of at least 3 different weapons firing from elevated positions inside the building. The insurgents had the high ground and superior numbers, but they had also revealed something crucial about their positioning. Maya pulled out a small notebook and began sketching rapidly. Her engineering training had taught her to visualize complex three-dimensional problems, and she was applying those same skills to their tactical situation. Within minutes, she had drawn a detailed map of the enemy positions based on the sound signatures and muzzle flashes she had observed. "Look at this," she said, showing Barnes her diagram. "They're positioned in a classic defensive formation, but they're all focused on the obvious approach routes. There's a blind spot on the northeastern corner where the old pipeline infrastructure creates a natural corridor." Barnes studied her sketch with growing interest. "Even if you're right about the blind spot, we'd still be outnumbered 10-1. And Thompson can't move with that leg wound." Maya nodded grimly. "I know. That's why we're not going to fight them conventionally. We're going to use their own tactics against them." She explained her plan quickly but thoroughly. The insurgents had used an electromagnetic pulse to disable their equipment, but Maya had noticed something during her analysis of the electronic signatures. The pulse had been localized and temporary, designed to knock out their immediate electronic systems without causing permanent damage to the insurgents' own equipment. "I still have one piece of functioning equipment," Maya said, pulling a small device from her vest. "It's a frequency analyzer that was shielded in a hardened case. If I can get close enough to their EMP device, I might be able to reverse engineer the frequency and turn it against them." Barnes stared at her in disbelief. "You want to sneak through 50 armed insurgents to sabotage their electronic warfare equipment? Chen, that's suicide." "Not if I do it right," Maya replied with a confidence that surprised even her. "I've been studying their movement patterns for the last 10 minutes. They're disciplined, but they're following predictable patrol routes, and more importantly, they're not expecting a single person to try to infiltrate their position." The plan that Maya outlined was unlike anything in standard military doctrine. Instead of trying to fight their way out or wait for rescue, she proposed to use the abandoned facility's industrial infrastructure to move unseen through the enemy positions. The old pipeline system created a network of maintenance tunnels and service corridors that wouldn't show up on any standard building schematic. "Even if you could get to their equipment," Barnes argued, "how do you know you can disable it?" Maya smiled grimly. "Because I helped design the countermeasures for this type of EMP device during my graduate research. The frequency signature I detected earlier was from a modified commercial generator, not military-grade equipment. If I can access the control system, I can overload it and take out their communications at the same time." Thompson, who had been conscious but quiet during their conversation, suddenly grabbed Maya's arm. "Chen," he whispered weakly, "if you're really going to try this crazy plan, you need to know something. These aren't ordinary insurgents. I got a good look at them before they hit me. They're too well equipped and too well trained. This feels like a professional military operation." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. If Thompson was right, then they weren't just dealing with local insurgents using improvised tactics. They were up against a trained military unit that had been planning this ambush for weeks or even months. But instead of making her more afraid, this realization actually strengthened her resolve. "That makes it even more important that we do something unexpected," Maya said. "Professional soldiers think like soldiers. They'll anticipate conventional military responses, but they won't be prepared for someone who approaches the problem from a completely different angle." Barnes looked at Thompson's pale face and then back at Maya's determined expression. "If you're really going to do this, you'll need to create a distraction so the captain and Martinez can reposition themselves, and you'll need someone to cover your approach." Maya shook her head. "No distractions. That would just alert them that something unusual is happening. I need to move like a ghost, completely undetected. One person can disappear in a way that a team never could." She began pulling specific pieces of equipment from her vest, assembling a compact kit that would allow her to access and manipulate electronic systems. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and Barnes realized that despite her small size and quiet demeanor, Maya Chen was probably the most technically capable person he had ever worked with. "How long will this take?" Barnes asked. "If everything goes perfectly, maybe 30 minutes, Maya replied. "If it goes wrong..." She didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood the implications. As Maya prepared to leave their defensive position, she looked back at Thompson and Barnes. "When you see their electronics start failing, that's your signal to move. Get Thompson to the extraction point and signal for evac with the emergency flares. What about you?" Barnes asked. Maya checked her sidearm one final time and gave him a smile that was equal parts nervous and determined. I'll be improvising. With that, she slipped away from their concrete barrier and disappeared into the maze of abandoned industrial equipment that surrounded the facility. Barnes watched her small figure vanish into the shadows and realized that their lives now depended on whether a quiet computer engineer from Boston could do something that no amount of military training had prepared any of them for. Maya moved through the industrial maze with a precision that would have surprised anyone who knew her, as the quiet technician who rarely spoke up during briefings. Every step was calculated, every movement flowing from one piece of cover to the next like water finding its way around obstacles. The engineering mind that had always made her feel like an outsider among the soldiers was now her greatest asset. She had studied the facility's layout for hours during mission preparation, but seeing it from ground level revealed details that no satellite image could capture. The old pipeline infrastructure created a three-dimensional puzzle of metal walkways, support structures, and maintenance access points. Maya realized that the insurgents, for all their military training, were thinking in 2 dimensions while she was operating in 3. The first enemy position she encountered was a sniper's nest on the 2nd floor of the main building. Through a gap in the rusted metal sheeting, Maya could see the insurgent scanning the area where her teammates were pinned down. He was positioned exactly where any military manual would recommend, with excellent fields of fire and multiple escape routes, but he was also positioned directly above a maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the building's foundation. Maya slipped into the tunnel system through an access hatch that had been hidden by years of accumulated debris. The space was cramped and filled with the musty smell of rust and stagnant water, but it allowed her to move completely unseen. As she crawled through the narrow passage, she could hear footsteps and muffled voices above her head. The insurgents were so confident in their superior position that they weren't even bothering to whisper. The tunnel led her to the building's mechanical room, where she could hear the distinctive hum of electronic equipment. Maya carefully lifted a ventilation grate and peered into the room above. What she saw confirmed her worst fears and best hopes simultaneously. The insurgents had indeed set up a sophisticated command center with communication equipment that was far beyond what local insurgents should have possessed. But they had also made the same mistake that most people made when dealing with unfamiliar technology. They had set everything up exactly according to the manufacturer's specifications. Maya recognized the EMP generator immediately. It was a commercial unit that had been modified for military use, probably stolen from a construction site or industrial facility. The setup was professional but not creative, which meant she knew exactly how to defeat it. The problem was getting to it without being detected by the 3 insurgents who were operating the equipment. For the next 10 minutes, Maya watched their patterns with the patience of a scientist observing laboratory subjects. The insurgents rotated through their duties with military precision, but precision could be predictable. Every 8 minutes, 2 of them would leave the room to check on the sniper positions, leaving only one person to monitor the electronic systems. It was a small window, but it would have to be enough. When the next rotation began, Maya waited until she heard the footsteps of the 2 departing insurgents fade away, before carefully pushing the ventilation grate aside. She lowered herself into the room with movements so fluid and silent that she seemed to float rather than climb down. The remaining insurgent was facing away from her, focused on a radio communication with his field units. Maya's approach was so quiet that she was within arm's reach before the insurgent sensed her presence. When he began to turn, Maya's training took over, but it wasn't military training that saved her. It was years of martial arts classes that her father had insisted she take for self-defense. The insurgent was bigger and stronger, but Maya was faster and more precise. Before he could call out or reach for his weapon, she had applied a chokehold that cut off the blood flow to his brain. He slumped unconscious without making a sound. With the room secured, Maya quickly went to work on the EMP generator. Her hands moved across the control panel with the confidence of someone who had spent years working with similar systems. Within minutes, she had not only disabled the device but reprogrammed it to create a feedback loop that would overload every piece of electronic equipment the insurgents were using. But Maya wasn't finished. She had noticed something else in the room that could tip the balance of the entire engagement. The insurgents' communication system was connected to a central hub that coordinated all their field units. If she could access that system, she might be able to do more than just level the playing field. Maya connected her portable frequency analyzer to the communication hub and began downloading their operational data. What she discovered made her heart race. The insurgents weren't just conducting a single ambush. They had been planning a series of coordinated attacks on American forces throughout the region. The data included detailed intelligence on troop movements, supply routes, and planned operations that could only have come from someone with high-level security clearance. As she worked to copy the critical information, Maya could hear footsteps returning to the mechanical room. The two insurgents who had left for their rotation were coming back early. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they discovered their unconscious colleague and raised the alarm. Maya made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. Instead of trying to escape immediately, she used her remaining time to plant a small device she had improvised from components in her equipment kit. It was essentially a digital virus that would propagate through their entire network, feeding them false information and gradually degrading their communication systems. When the footsteps were almost at the door, Maya finally moved toward her escape route. But as she reached for the ventilation grate, she realized that her route was blocked. The unconscious insurgent had fallen in a position that would make it impossible for her to reach the opening without moving him, and there wasn't time for that. Maya looked around the room desperately and spotted her only alternative, a small window that led to an external fire escape. It was a much more exposed route, but it was her only option. She grabbed her equipment and headed for the window just as the door to the mechanical room began to open. The next 60 seconds tested every skill Maya had ever learned. She slipped through the window and onto the fire escape, just as the two insurgents entered the room and discovered their unconscious teammate. Their shouts of alarm would bring every hostile in the facility running toward the mechanical room. But Maya was already 3 floors down and moving through the external infrastructure of the building. As she reached the ground level, Maya triggered the device she had planted in their communication system. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the facility, insurgent radios began emitting bursts of feedback that made communication impossible. More importantly, the modified EMP generator activated in reverse, sending a pulse through their entire electronic network that fried everything from night vision equipment to electronic weapon sites. For the first time since the ambush began, Maya's teammates would have a technological advantage, but Maya wasn't done yet. She still had the intelligence data she had downloaded, and she had one more surprise planned for the insurgents who had thought they were hunting helpless prey. As chaos erupted throughout the facility and confused voices began shouting in multiple languages, Maya Chen disappeared back into the industrial labyrinth like a ghost. But this time she wasn't running away from the enemy. She was positioning herself for a counterattack that would turn the hunters into the hunted. The chaos that erupted following Maya's sabotage was unlike anything the insurgents had prepared for. Their carefully coordinated ambush dissolved into confusion as communication networks failed and electronic equipment sparked and died throughout the facility. Maya could hear the panic in their voices as they shouted contradictory orders in the darkness, their night vision systems rendered useless by the electromagnetic pulse she had turned against them. But Maya wasn't content to simply level the playing field. The intelligence data she had downloaded revealed something that changed everything about their situation. This wasn't just an ambush. It was the opening move in a much larger operation designed to cripple American forces in the entire region. The insurgents had planned to capture members of Delta Squad alive to extract information about upcoming military operations. As Maya moved through the industrial maze, she began implementing a plan that was part military tactics and part psychological warfare. She had studied the downloaded intelligence data during her escape from the mechanical room, and she now knew the insurgents' communication protocols, their command structure, and most importantly, their weaknesses. The first thing Maya did was use the insurgents' own communication system against them. Her portable frequency analyzer could mimic their radio signatures, and she began broadcasting false information on their emergency channels. She reported imaginary American reinforcements approaching from multiple directions, fictional air support en route, and non-existent sniper teams taking positions around the facility. The effect was immediate. Maya could hear the insurgents' leaders trying to verify these reports while simultaneously dealing with the failure of their electronic systems. Their disciplined formation began to break down as units were redirected to deal with threats that existed only in Maya's imagination. But psychological warfare was only the beginning. Maya had spent her entire academic career studying how complex systems could be disrupted and manipulated. The insurgent operation was just another complex system, and she was about to demonstrate how one person with the right knowledge could bring the entire thing crashing down. Maya's next target was the insurgents' ammunition depot, which she had located using the intelligence data from their command center. The depot was positioned in what had once been the facility's chemical storage area, protected by 2 guards and positioned to support their entire operation. But Maya had noticed something in the building schematics that the insurgents had missed. The chemical storage area was connected to the facility's old ventilation system, which included emergency gas venting protocols designed to prevent toxic buildups. Maya accessed the ventilation controls through a maintenance panel that had been overlooked during the insurgents' occupation of the facility. Within minutes, she had created a localized atmospheric disturbance that made it impossible for the guards to remain at their posts. As the guards abandoned their position to escape the uncomfortable air conditions, Maya slipped into the ammunition depot, but instead of trying to destroy their supplies with explosives, which would have alerted every insurgent in the area, she did something far more subtle and devastating. Maya had brought a small container of concentrated salt water as part of her equipment maintenance kit. She carefully applied microscopic amounts of the corrosive solution to the firing pins and ammunition contacts of their weapons and explosives. The sabotage was invisible to casual inspection, but it would cause their weapons to malfunction at the worst possible moment. Her engineering background had taught her that the most effective way to disable a complex system wasn't to destroy it completely, but to introduce small failures that would cascade into complete system breakdown. Over the next 20 minutes, Maya moved through the facility like a ghost, introducing tiny malfunctions and subtle sabotage that would turn their own equipment against them. But Maya's most audacious move was yet to come. She had realized that the insurgents' biggest advantage wasn't their numbers or their superior position. It was their confidence. They believed they were facing a trapped and helpless enemy. Maya was about to demonstrate just how wrong they were. Using her knowledge of the facility's industrial systems, Maya accessed the building's old public address system through a maintenance panel in the basement. The system had been designed to broadcast safety announcements throughout the complex, and while it was old and partially damaged, it still functioned on the lower frequencies. Maya's voice echoed through the facility, speaking in perfect Arabic that she had learned during her graduate studies in Middle Eastern engineering systems. But what she said sent chills through every insurgent who heard it. "This is the Angel of Death," Maya's voice announced calmly through the crackling speakers. "You came here to hunt soldiers, but you have awakened something else entirely. Your communications are compromised. Your weapons will fail you. Your leaders are receiving false information. You are no longer the hunters. You are the prey." The psychological impact of the announcement was devastating. The insurgents had been trained to fight soldiers, not to deal with an unseen enemy who could penetrate their defenses and turn their own systems against them. Maya could hear the fear in their voices as they tried to locate the source of the broadcast while dealing with the cascade of equipment failures she had set in motion. But Maya wasn't finished. She had one final surprise that would turn their numerical advantage into a liability. Using the facility's industrial lighting system, she began creating a pattern of light and darkness that would drive the insurgents toward specific areas of the complex. The pattern was based on her analysis of their movement patterns and psychological profiles. She was essentially herding them like sheep toward a killing zone, where her teammates could engage them with maximum advantage. As the insurgents moved through the facility, following the unconscious guidance of Maya's lighting manipulation, they began to encounter the weapons malfunctions she had sabotaged earlier. Rifles jammed at critical moments. Grenades failed to detonate properly. Electronic weapon sights flickered and died just as targets came into view. Meanwhile, Maya had re-established contact with her teammates using a backup communication system she had improvised from components salvaged from the insurgents' own equipment. Captain Rodriguez and his team were now able to coordinate their movements and take advantage of the chaos Maya had created. But perhaps most importantly, Maya had gathered intelligence that would prevent the larger attack the insurgents had been planning. The data she had downloaded contained detailed information about sleeper cells, weapons caches, and planned operations throughout the region. This single mission had uncovered a network that could have caused massive casualties among American forces. As Maya prepared for the final phase of her improvised counterattack, she reflected on how completely her situation had changed. Just hours earlier, she had been the quiet technician who felt out of place among professional soldiers. Now she was conducting a solo operation that was dismantling an entire enemy network from the inside. The insurgents, who had thought they were ambushing a helpless technical specialist, were about to discover that they had actually trapped themselves in a facility with someone who could think and fight in ways they had never imagined. Maya Chen was no longer just the team's technician. She had become something far more dangerous, a ghost in their machine who was systematically destroying everything they had built. The final phase of Maya's counterattack began at dawn, when the first rays of sunlight revealed the full extent of the chaos she had unleashed throughout the facility. What had started as a carefully planned ambush by 50 well-trained insurgents had devolved into complete pandemonium. Their communication networks were compromised, their weapons were failing, and their leadership structure had collapsed under the weight of conflicting information and cascading system failures. Maya positioned herself on the facility's highest observation deck, using a maintenance ladder that had been hidden behind decades of rust and debris. From this vantage point, she could see the entire battlefield and coordinate the final movements that would complete the transformation, from ambush to rescue mission. Through her improvised communication system, Maya was now in constant contact with Captain Rodriguez, Lieutenant Barnes, and the other members of Delta Squad. The psychological warfare she had conducted throughout the night had driven the insurgents into predictable patterns of movement, and now her teammates were positioned to exploit every advantage she had created. Delta 1. "This is Chen," Maya whispered into her makeshift radio. "I have eyes on the entire facility. The enemy has consolidated into 3 main groups, and they're all positioned exactly where I predicted they would be." Rodriguez's voice crackled back through the speaker. "Chen, I don't know how you pulled this off, but you've given us a fighting chance. What's the tactical situation?" Maya consulted the detailed notes she had been making throughout the night. "Group Alpha is holed up in the main processing building. They have about 15 people, but their weapons have been compromised and their communication with the other groups has been severed. Group Beta is in the vehicle maintenance area with about 20 people. They're trying to establish a new command center, but they don't know that I'm feeding them false intelligence through their own systems." "What about Group Gamma?" Rodriguez asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Maya replied. "Group Gamma has about 15 people, and they're positioned in what they think is a defensive stronghold near the facility's main entrance. But they don't realize that their position is actually a trap I've been preparing all night." Maya had spent hours studying the facility's industrial systems, and she had discovered that the area where Group Gamma had positioned themselves was directly beneath a massive water storage tank that was part of the facility's old fire suppression system. The tank contained thousands of gallons of water, and Maya had carefully weakened the support structures using industrial tools she had found in the maintenance areas. "On my signal," Maya continued, "you're going to advance on Groups Alpha and Beta simultaneously. The weapons malfunctions I sabotaged will prevent them from mounting effective resistance. Meanwhile, I'm going to deal with Group Gamma personally." Barnes's voice cut into the conversation. "Chen, that's 15 armed hostiles. Even with their equipment compromised, that's still too many for one person to handle." Maya smiled grimly as she checked her final preparations. "Lieutenant, I'm not planning to fight them. I'm planning to make them fight physics, and physics always wins." The coordinated attack began exactly at sunrise. Rodriguez and Martinez advanced on Group Alpha while Barnes, despite his wounded leg, provided covering fire for their assault on Group Beta. The insurgents' compromised weapons failed at critical moments, turning what should have been a desperate firefight into a tactical victory for the vastly outnumbered American forces. Meanwhile, Maya was putting the final touches on her most ambitious sabotage yet. She had calculated the precise structural stresses needed to bring down the water storage tank, and she had positioned improvised explosives at the key support points. The explosives weren't military ordnance. They were improvised devices created from industrial chemicals she had found throughout the facility. As Groups Alpha and Beta fell to her teammates' coordinated assault, Maya triggered the demolition of the water storage tank. The massive structure collapsed with a thunderous roar, releasing thousands of gallons of water that swept through Group Gamma's position like a tsunami. The insurgents who weren't knocked unconscious by the impact were left disoriented and weaponless, their equipment destroyed by the sudden flood. But Maya's greatest triumph wasn't the tactical victory she had orchestrated. As she climbed down from her observation post, she clutched the intelligence data she had downloaded from the insurgents' command center. The information contained details about a network of terrorist cells that had been planning coordinated attacks throughout the region for months. Base camp. "This is Delta 1, Rodriguez announced over Maya's restored communication system. "The facility is secure and we have priority intelligence for immediate transmission." Maya joined her teammates as they secured the few surviving insurgents and began processing the captured intelligence. The look of respect in their eyes was something she had never seen before. Sergeant Thompson, despite his wounded leg, actually saluted her when she approached their position. "Chen," Thompson said with genuine admiration, "I owe you an apology. I said you didn't belong here because you couldn't fight. But you just took apart 50 trained hostiles without firing a shot. That's not fighting. That's warfare at a level I've never seen before." Maya looked around at the facility that had been transformed from an enemy stronghold into a captured intelligence goldmine. The insurgents who had survived were confused and demoralized, unable to understand how their carefully planned operation had been turned against them so completely. Captain Rodriguez approached Maya with the expression of amazement and gratitude. "Chen, what you did here tonight goes beyond anything in the tactical manuals. You didn't just save our lives, you prevented a series of attacks that could have killed hundreds of our people." Maya nodded quietly, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. "Captain, I think I finally understand something. I always felt like I didn't belong with the team because I couldn't fight like a soldier. But maybe that was exactly why you needed me here. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't military training. It's thinking about problems in ways that the enemy can't predict or counter." As military helicopters appeared on the horizon, coming to extract Delta Squad and process the intelligence they had captured, Maya realized that her role within the team had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just the technician who kept their equipment running. She had become something entirely new, a hybrid warrior who could fight battles on multiple levels, simultaneously. The insurgents had made a fatal mistake when they assumed that the quiet woman with the thick glasses would be the weakest link in Delta Squad's chain. Instead, they had discovered that Maya Chen was something far more dangerous than any conventional soldier. She was a force multiplier who could turn any environment into a weapon and any enemy strength into a vulnerability. The ambush that was supposed to destroy Delta Squad had instead revealed that their most valuable asset had been hiding in plain sight all along. 3 months after the mission that changed everything, Maya Chen sat in a briefing room at a classified military installation, looking across the table at a panel of senior officers who still seemed to be struggling to understand what had happened at the abandoned facility. The intelligence she had captured had led to the dismantling of terrorist networks across 3 countries, and the tactical innovations she had demonstrated were being studied by military academies around the world. Technical Specialist Chen, General Morrison began, reading from a thick file. "Your actions during the ambush resulted in the capture of 47 enemy combatants, the prevention of coordinated attacks that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties, and the acquisition of intelligence that has fundamentally altered our understanding of terrorist operations in the region." Maya nodded politely, still feeling somewhat uncomfortable with the attention her actions had generated. She had been through dozens of debriefings, interviewed by intelligence analysts, and even consulted on the development of new tactical doctrines. But despite all the recognition, she remained essentially the same quiet engineer who had always preferred solving problems to talking about them. "The question before us today," General Morrison continued, "is how to best utilize your unique skill set going forward. You've proven that conventional military thinking has limitations that can be overcome by unconventional approaches to warfare." The other officers around the table nodded in agreement. Maya had become something of a legend within the special operations community, but she had also created a problem that no one quite knew how to solve. She didn't fit into any existing military classification, and her methods couldn't be easily taught or replicated. "Ma'am," Maya said carefully, "I appreciate the recognition, but I think there might be some misunderstanding about what happened out there." I didn't do anything that any competent engineer couldn't have done with the right training and preparation. Colonel Hayes, who had been studying Maya's mission reports for weeks, shook his head. Chen, you single-handedly neutralized 50 trained insurgents using improvised tactics that no military manual has ever described. That's not just engineering, that's a completely new form of warfare. Maya considered this assessment carefully. Over the past 3 months, she had been forced to analyze her own actions and try to understand how her background had prepared her for something that no training program had ever anticipated. The truth was that she had been unconsciously preparing for that night her entire life. I think what happened, Maya said slowly, was that I approached a military problem like an engineering problem. Instead of trying to defeat the enemy through superior firepower or tactics, I treated their entire operation like a complex system that could be analyzed, understood, and then systematically dismantled. She stood up and moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room, beginning to sketch the same kind of diagrams she had drawn during the mission. Every military operation is essentially a complex system with inputs, outputs, feedback loops, and failure points. Most military training focuses on optimizing our own systems, but engineering training teaches you how to find and exploit the failure points in any system. The officers watched as Maya drew interconnected diagrams showing how she had analyzed the insurgents' operation from multiple perspectives simultaneously. She had treated their communication networks like electrical circuits, their command structure like a computer program, and their psychological state like a control system that could be manipulated through carefully applied inputs. The reason traditional military tactics weren't working, Maya explained, was that we were trying to fight them on their terms using their rules. But there's no rule that says warfare has to be conducted according to military doctrine. Sometimes the most effective approach is to change the rules entirely. General Morrison leaned forward with interest. Are you saying that this approach could be systematized and taught to other personnel? Maya shook her head. Not exactly. You can't teach someone to think like an engineer overnight. But you can create teams that combine different types of expertise in ways that multiply their individual capabilities. She turned back to the whiteboard and began sketching a new organizational structure. What if, instead of trying to make soldiers think like engineers, we created hybrid units that included engineers, psychologists, computer scientists, and other specialists working alongside traditional military personnel? The concept Maya was describing was revolutionary. Instead of treating warfare as a purely military discipline, she was proposing to approach it as a multidisciplinary problem that required diverse forms of expertise. The implications were staggering. The enemy will always adapt to our conventional tactics, Maya continued. But if every unit includes people who think about problems in fundamentally different ways, we'll always have asymmetric advantages that they can't predict or counter. Colonel Hayes was taking extensive notes. Chen, you're describing a fundamental shift in how we organize and deploy our forces. This could change everything about how we conduct operations. Maya smiled slightly. Colonel, I think that's exactly the point. The world is changing and our enemies are becoming more sophisticated and adaptive. We need to change faster than they do, and the only way to do that is to embrace approaches that they can't understand or replicate. Over the next hour, Maya outlined a comprehensive program for integrating technical specialists into combat units, not as support personnel, but as equal partners in tactical planning and execution. She described training programs that would teach soldiers to think like engineers and engineers to understand military objectives. Most importantly, she proposed a new doctrine that would treat every mission as a complex problem requiring multiple forms of expertise. When the briefing concluded, General Morrison stood up and addressed Maya directly. Technical Specialist Chen, you've given us a lot to think about. But before we discuss your future assignments, I need to ask you a personal question. After what you've been through, do you want to continue this kind of work? Maya looked around the room at the senior officers who were waiting for her answer. 3 months ago, she had been a quiet engineer who felt out of place among soldiers. Today, she was being asked to help reshape the future of warfare itself. General, Maya said with quiet confidence, I've spent my whole life feeling like I didn't fit into any particular category. I was too technical for normal social situations, but too unconventional for traditional engineering roles. For the first time in my life, I feel like I've found something that makes use of everything I am instead of just part of what I can do. She paused and looked directly at General Morrison. Yes, sir. I want to continue this work, but I want to do it right. I want to build something that will save lives and protect people, not just create new ways to fight wars. General Morrison nodded approvingly. Chen, I think you're going to find that the best way to prevent wars is to be so good at fighting them that no one wants to test you. As Maya left the briefing room that day, she knew that her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. She was no longer just the team's technician who had surprised everyone with hidden capabilities. She had become the architect of an entirely new approach to warfare, one that would reshape how military forces around the world thought about training, tactics, and the very nature of combat itself. The quiet engineer who had once felt like an outsider had found her true calling as a bridge between worlds, someone who could translate between different forms of expertise and create solutions that no single discipline could achieve alone. Maya Chen had become proof that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in any conflict is someone who refuses to accept that there are only traditional ways to fight.